My dad kicked me out at 18. Now he wants to walk me down the aisle. Should I let him? I'm Emily, 28 years old, and I'm about to get married next month. What should be the happiest time of my life has turned into a complicated mess of emotions, all because my estranged father is suddenly trying to get back in touch. I guess I need to explain how we got here, because this story really began when I was just 6 years old. It was a crisp autumn day when my world fell apart. I remember sitting on the stairs, listening to my parents argue in hushed tones. That's when I found out my dad, Robert, had cheated on my mom, Sarah, with a woman named Diane, who would later become my stepmother. The divorce was quick and messy, leaving me caught in the middle of two bitter adults. After the split, I spent most of my time with my mom. She was heartbroken but did her best to shield me from the pain. We'd spend weekends baking cookies and watching old movies, trying to create a new normal for ourselves. But during holidays and vacations, I'd stay with my dad and his new family. When I was 8, my half-brother Jake was born. He was a chubby, happy baby, always giggling and reaching out for hugs. At first, I was excited to be a big sister. I imagined teaching him to read, playing games together, and being his protector. But reality quickly set in. Whenever I visited, I was expected to be Jake's primary caretaker. Emily, can you change Jake's diaper? Emily, Jake's crying. Go see what he wants. Emily, it's time to feed Jake. It was like I had become an unpaid babysitter rather than a daughter or sister. As the years went by, the divide between me and my father's new family grew wider. Diane tried her best to include me, inviting me to help decorate for holidays or asking about my day at school. But she always deferred to my father's wishes, never standing up for me when it really mattered. When I was 14, my mom got an incredible job opportunity abroad. It was her dream job, something she'd been working towards for years. I could see the excitement in her eyes when she told me about it, but also the worry. She didn't want to leave me behind, but we both knew it was the best choice for her career. You could come with me, she offered, but we both knew that wasn't practical. The international school in her new location was incredibly expensive, and she'd be working long hours. So, with a heavy heart, I moved in with my dad full-time. I thought maybe this would be our chance to bond, to finally become a real family. How naive I was. Living with my dad was like being a ghost in my own home. I was there, but not really seen or heard. My presence was tolerated, but never celebrated. I'd come home from school, do my homework in silence, and then retreat to my room. Dinner times were the worst. I'd sit at the table, listening to my dad, Diane, and Jake chat about their days, feeling like an intruder in their perfect family picture. One day, about a month after I'd moved in, I overheard my dad talking to Diane in the kitchen. I just don't know how to connect with her, he said, frustration evident in his voice. It's like having a stranger in the house. Diane's voice was soft, placating. Give it time, Robert. She's still adjusting. But time didn't make things better. If anything, it only made the distance between us grow. The Disney trip fiasco happened not long after that. I remember the excitement I felt when my dad announced we were all going to Disney World. For once, I thought, I'd be included in a family activity. I spent weeks daydreaming about riding roller coasters, meeting Mickey Mouse, and maybe even having a real conversation with my dad. The night before the trip, I was in my room packing when my dad knocked on the door. Emily, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. About the trip. We've decided it should just be me, Diane, and Jake. You understand, right? It's our first big trip with Jake, and we want it to be a special family moment. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. But, aren't I family too? I asked, my voice small. My dad shifted uncomfortably. Of course you are. It's just different. You're older, you've been to Disney before. This is Jake's first time. I wanted to argue, to scream, to make him see how unfair this was. But I just nodded, fighting back tears. Okay, Dad. Have a good trip. The next morning, I watched from my bedroom window as they loaded up the car, Jake bouncing with excitement. As they drove away, I felt a piece of my heart go with them. This became a pattern. Beach trips, zoo outings, even simple dinners out, I was always left behind. It's a family thing, my dad would say, as if I wasn't part of that family. My social life suffered too. My dad had strict rules about me going out with friends or having them over. Teenagers together only cause trouble, he'd say, his tone brooking no argument. He'd call the house phone at random times to check if I was home, and he even enlisted our neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, to keep an eye on me. Mrs. Thompson was a kind woman in her 60s who lived next door. She'd often invite me over for tea and cookies, providing a brief respite from the loneliness at home. "Your father just wants to keep you safe," she'd say, patting my hand. But I could see the pity in her eyes. As I entered my junior year of high school, the feeling of being an extra in my own home only intensified. I threw myself into my studies, staying late at school for club activities and spending weekends at the library. Anything to avoid being at home. It was during this time that I met Lisa, who would become my best friend. We bonded over our shared love of science and our complicated family situations. Lisa's parents were going through a messy divorce, and she understood what it felt like to be caught in the middle. "You can always come over to my place," Lisa offered one day after I confided in her about my home situation. "My mom won't mind." I was grateful for the offer, but terrified of my dad's reaction if he found out I wasn't at home. So I declined, choosing instead to suffer in silence. The summer before my senior year, my dad got a big promotion at work. He came home one day, practically bursting with excitement. "We're going to celebrate with a family trip to Europe," he announced at dinner. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Maybe this time, I'd be included. Maybe this was his way of making up for all the times I'd been left behind. "That's great, Dad," I said, trying to keep the eagerness out of my voice. "Where in Europe are we going?" He looked at me, surprise flashing across his face as if he'd forgotten I was there. "Oh, Emily. I'm sorry, but we don't have enough money for 4 tickets. This trip is to celebrate Jake's 10th birthday." And just like that, the hope turned to ash. I pushed my chair back from the table, appetite gone. "Of course," I muttered. "It's always about Jake." "What was that?" my dad asked sharply. "Nothing," I said, heading to my room. "Have a great trip." The day they left for Europe was the day everything changed. I'd been simmering with resentment for years, and it all came boiling over. As they were loading up the taxi to head to the airport, I couldn't hold it in anymore. "This isn't fair," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "You always do this. It's always about Jake, never about me." My dad's face darkened with anger. "How dare you? After everything we've done for you. You live here rent-free, we feed you, clothe you. Mom sends you money for me." I shot back. "And I do all the housework because you and Diane are never home." "You ungrateful, spoiled brat," he yelled. "If you're so unhappy here, why don't you just leave?" "Fine," I screamed. "Maybe I will." I stormed back into the house, slamming the door behind me. I expected him to follow, to apologize, to try and make things right. But minutes ticked by, and all I heard was the sound of the taxi driving away. Furious and hurt, I started packing a bag. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere seemed better than here. As I was shoving clothes into my backpack, my bedroom door flew open. My dad stood there, face red with rage. "You want to leave? Fine. Get out. You're no daughter of mine." Before I could react, he grabbed my arm and started dragging me towards the front door. I was too shocked to resist. He shoved me out onto the porch, then went back inside. Moments later, my backpack and a few other belongings came flying out after me. "Dad, please," I begged, finally finding my voice. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean." But the door slammed shut, cutting off my words. I stood there on the sidewalk, surrounded by my hastily thrown belongings, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. I don't know how long I sat there, crying on the curb. The sun was setting when I finally pulled myself together enough to think about what to do next. I couldn't call my mom, she was on a business trip in Japan and probably in the middle of an important meeting. I scrolled through my phone contacts, trying to think of who I could turn to. That's when I remembered Lisa's offer. With shaking hands, I dialed her number. "Emily? What's wrong?" Lisa's concerned voice came through the speaker. Through sobs, I managed to explain what had happened. Without hesitation, Lisa said, "I'm coming to get you. Stay where you are." 20 minutes later, Lisa's beat-up Corolla pulled up to the curb. She jumped out and enveloped me in a hug. "Oh, Em," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." We loaded my things into her car and drove to her house. Lisa's mom, a kind-faced woman named Carol, was waiting for us. She took one look at my tear-stained face and pulled me into a motherly embrace. "You can stay here as long as you need," she said firmly. I spent that night in Lisa's room, both of us squished onto her twin bed like we were kids at a sleepover. But there was no laughter, no secret sharing. Just me crying softly while Lisa held my hand. The next morning, hope stirred in my chest. Maybe my dad had calmed down. Maybe he regretted what he'd done. With Lisa by my side for moral support, I went back to the house. What I found broke my heart all over again. My remaining belongings were still scattered on the sidewalk, some even tossed into the trash. As we approached the house, the front door opened. For a moment, I thought it was my dad coming to apologize. But it was Diane, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. "Emily," she said softly. "I'm so sorry about all of this." She handed me a box. "I saved what I could of your things. Your father. He's still very angry. I think it's best if you don't come back for a while." I nodded numbly, taking the box. "Thank you, Diane," I managed to say. As we turned to leave, Diane called out, "Emily. For what it's worth, I always thought of you as my daughter too." I couldn't bring myself to respond. I just got back into Lisa's car, clutching the box of rescued belongings to my chest. The next few weeks were a blur. I stayed with Lisa and her mom, trying to figure out what to do next. I managed to get in touch with my mom, who was horrified by what had happened. She wanted to come home immediately, but I convinced her to stay and finish her contract. It was only a few more months, and I didn't want her to jeopardize her career because of me. About a month after the blow-up, I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered it. "You ungrateful little bitch." My father's voice exploded through the speaker. "Your mother stopped sending money for your expenses. How dare you turn her against me?" I hung up without a word, then burst into tears. Lisa, who had been sitting next to me, pulled me into a hug. "That's it," she said firmly. "We're changing your number." As the dust settled and my senior year of high school began, I threw myself into my studies with renewed vigor. I was determined to get into a good college, to build a life for myself far away from the pain of my childhood home. My hard work paid off. I was accepted into an engineering program at a university in another state. The day the acceptance letter came, I cried tears of joy and relief. This was my ticket to a new life. When I arrived on campus that fall, I felt like I could finally breathe. Here, nobody knew me as the unwanted daughter or the family outcast. I could be whoever I wanted to be. It was during orientation week that I met Mark. He was a senior, volunteering as a guide for the freshmen. Tall, with kind brown eyes and a quick smile, he immediately put me at ease. "So, engineering, huh?" he said as he showed me around the science buildings. "What made you choose that?" I shrugged. I've always loved building things, figuring out how they work. Plus, I like the idea of creating something that can make people's lives better. Mark's eyes lit up. "That's exactly why I got into it too. Have you ever thought about focusing on sustainable energy? That's my passion." And just like that, we were off, chatting excitedly about solar panels and wind turbines. By the end of the tour, I felt like I'd known Mark for years. Over the next few weeks, Mark and I kept running into each other. He'd wave to me in the cafeteria or stop to chat between classes. One day, he invited me to join his study group. "Fair warning," he said with a grin, "we're all engineering nerds. Expect a lot of terrible math puns." I laughed. Sounds perfect to me. As the semester progressed, Mark and I grew closer. We'd often find ourselves the last two left at the study sessions, talking long after everyone else had gone home. It wasn't just about engineering anymore, we shared our dreams, our fears, our pasts. One night, as we were walking back to the dorms after a particularly late study session, Mark stopped suddenly. Emily, he said, his voice serious. I really like you. As more than just a friend. Would you? Would you like to go on a date with me? My heart soared. I'd love to, I replied, unable to keep the smile off my face. Our first date was at a tiny Italian restaurant just off campus. We talked for hours, barely noticing as the restaurant emptied around us. As Mark walked me back to my dorm, he took my hand in his. It felt right, like our hands were made to fit together. The years at university flew by. Mark and I graduated, both landing jobs at engineering firms in the same city. We moved in together, adopting a scruffy rescue dog named Einstein. Life was good. I had a career I loved, a wonderful partner, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. The pain of my past was still there, a dull ache that would flare up sometimes, but it no longer defined me. And then, on a sunny Saturday morning in the park, with Einstein bounding around us, Mark got down on one knee. Emily, he said, his voice trembling slightly. You're my best friend, my partner in everything. Will you marry me? Tears of joy streaming down my face, I said yes. The next few months were a whirlwind of wedding planning. My mom flew in to help, bringing my stepdad, John, with her. John had been more of a father to me in the past few years than my biological dad ever was. When I asked him to walk me down the aisle, he teared up and pulled me into a bear hug. I'd be honored, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Everything was falling into place. We decided on a small, intimate wedding, just our closest family and friends. I rarely use social media, but I did post a picture of my engagement ring on Instagram. It was only my 10th post in 6 years. About a month after I accepted Mark's proposal, I received a message on Instagram that made my blood run cold. It was from my father. Emily, sweetheart. I just heard about your engagement. I'm so excited to help with the wedding. When should I book my flight? I can't wait to walk you down the aisle. I stared at the message in disbelief. After years of silence, he thought he could just waltz back into my life? The audacity was breathtaking. With shaking hands, I typed out a response. I'm sorry, but you won't be walking me down the aisle. My stepfather will be doing that. The wedding is small, just for close family. I hit send and then immediately blocked him. I thought that would be the end of it. But a week later, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, I was shocked to see Jake standing there, looking awkward and holding an envelope. Hey, Emily, he said, shuffling his feet. Dad asked me to give you this. I took the envelope, thanked Jake, and closed the door. For a long moment, I just stared at it, unsure whether I even wanted to read its contents. Finally, curiosity won out, and I opened it. Inside was a letter from my father, expressing how sorry he was for everything. He wrote about feeling regret when he saw pictures of my graduation with Mom and John. He admitted his pride had held him back from reaching out earlier, and that he now realized he'd missed out on so much. He ended by saying he wanted to fulfill one of the plans he'd made when I was born, to pay for my wedding and walk me down the aisle. I sat there, letter in hand, feeling a whirlwind of emotions. Part of me wanted to tear up the letter and forget about it. But another part, a small voice I thought I'd silenced long ago, wondered if this could be a chance for healing. After days of internal debate and long talks with Mark, my mom, and my therapist, I decided to meet with my father. We arranged to meet at a neutral location, a small cafe in the city. When I saw him, I was struck by how much older he looked. His hair had gone completely gray, and there were deep lines around his eyes. As soon as he saw me, he stood up, looking uncertain. Emily, he said, his voice cracking. Thank you for meeting me. We sat down, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, taking a deep breath, I said, I read your letter. I appreciate your apology, but I need you to understand something. You hurt me, deeply and repeatedly. It's going to take more than one letter to fix that. He nodded, looking down at his hands. I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I'd like a chance to try and make things right. If you'll let me. We talked for hours. There were tears, raised voices, and moments of painful silence. But by the end, we had reached a tentative understanding. I wasn't ready to have him walk me down the aisle or pay for the wedding, those honors would still go to John, but I was willing to invite him to the ceremony. As the wedding day approached, I found myself feeling a mix of excitement and anxiety. But when I walked down the aisle on John's arm, seeing Mark waiting for me with that big, goofy grin of his, all my worries melted away. During the reception, my father approached me. "You look beautiful, Emily," he said softly. "I'm so proud of the woman you've become, even though I had no part in it. Thank you for allowing me to be here today." I gave him a small smile. "Thank you for coming, Dad." It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was still a lot of healing to be done, a lot of trust to be rebuilt. But as I looked around at my new husband, my mom, John, and yes, even my dad, I felt a sense of peace. My family might not be perfect, but it was mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I truly belonged.